Say guten Tag, vielen Dank for the introduction. It's really nice to be here. I want to first begin by thanking Professor Tama for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back in Erlangen and to hopefully present something which will be challenging for all of us as scholars because it's about epistemology and its application to this particularly important and challenging topic. And so I would like to start by saying that I have thought initially that I would be presenting sort of some basic concepts, about sort of the field of violence in Islam, looking back at some of the important key concepts, of course, of jihad, but also of qital and harb and even ghazu, and all of this, which one can find sort of in different ways in the tradition, especially going back to the Quran itself. I think a lot of work has been done in this area, and while I think that I will eventually in the paper obviously have a section that goes over some of the basics, because that's very important for the concept of the books that are to be reached to a broader audience. In this presentation, I want to focus more on a meta level of analysis, when I actually want to look at the different ways and approaches that we as scholars have developed the approach to the study of violence in the name of Islam and so on and so forth. Obviously, there's a context to which a lot of this attention, both scholarly and not so scholarly, has been in, and those are the three main elements over the last few decades, of course, which all of us, of course, are aware of. But they're particularly important because they shape in some ways the way in which we respond as scholars to the study of this particular topic. And it's fascinating to see, given this broad context, what kinds of responses have taken place, and often at times diametrically opposed in positioning on some of these issues, as I will hopefully bring out in the last few, in those 10 epistemological questions that I'm raising. I'd like to also thank my collaborator, Dr. Wael Saleh, with whom I've gotten a grant from the Canada Research Council in the humanities and social sciences in order to do some of this study over the last 2 years. And so he's been invaluable in helping me and doing together some thinking on some of these issues. And so this is why his name appeared on the first page as well. I think that as I'm saying, what I want to do is an effort at mapping the different epistemologies maybe that are behind the study of violence in Islam, or what I often like to call also violence committed in the name of Islam. That's already a different spin, as you obviously can see on the question, and I'm not going to be debating whether one is better than the other. I'm just laying it out there. At the intersection between, of course, academic scholarship and contemporary transnational, social, regional, political, and there's a word that goes down here, dynamics. I hope this is not going to happen on the other slide. It didn't appear this way on my computer. Anyway, let me start with the first question. What angle is used to study violence in Islam? And I'll often just reduce it to this one, violence in Islam, and not always the two, because it's too long. So, of course, there's a first approach which we might we might refer to as a structuralist approach, which often focused research on asking two specific questions: why the violence in Islam in particular, and what are the root causes? And of course, there's a variety of disciplinary ways in which one can go into looking at this and trying to find some answers to these two basic questions. Then the second group is more what we would call processual approaches. They focus on studying how to use the use of violence is the result of a gradual socialization process with multiple dimensions and not necessarily theological. And now I realize that there is a problem because this problem of overlap was not on my computer. And so I'll do my best. And so out of this, I have a question, which is at the end, when you're looking at these two different approaches, whether structural or processual, are both approaches, in fact, also having a problem because they focus maybe more on individual paths to radicalization and less so on social and cultural contexts that produce trajectories of radicalization. So that's one initial question that I'm going to be raising, and we can come back to a lot of these things as we discuss later on. A second approach, of course, which is more rooted in ethnographic approaches, is what we'd call belonging to Islam or socioeconomic context. And so the results here are contradictory. So we have Muslims would be more prone to radicalization than other believers in this approach, and Islamic or Muslim identity predominates as the factor supposedly explaining the behavior. And I'm the one who's added supposedly in the bracket here. And these are the references to the scholars that I'm using. Second is the most of the radicals are not okay. I'm just now wondering what version this is. 1 second. We need to check one thing. That's right. Anyway. So I'll just translate this one, sorry, this one. And so the second part is that most of the radicalized are not, did not go through a particular training in religious fundamentalism because in fact they come from un-Islamic backgrounds themselves. And in fact they're not coming from a very knowledgeable sort of, or even in any sense, a religious culture of any sort. And so that of course means that for them, religion is not at all the reason for why they would actually become radicalized. So another question to ask, which is maybe reflective a little bit more of political approaches, is Islamism, which of course has been the key term that has been used in the field as the way of talking about political Islam, is it moderate or violent? There are 4 categories of results in this context. There's Keppel and Namshishi who talk about Islamism as a movement that is violent by nature. So that's one approach. Another one, which is more Khan and Burqa, are about the understanding that Islamism is a broad movement, but it's essentially more moderate in nature. Then Zollner talks about the importance of looking at both of these aspects of violence and moderation as coexisting, in fact, to different degrees in different contexts of the Islamist movement. And then finally, there's another approach of Ferrier, which talks about Islamists as that are in the process of converting to moderation despite many challenges lying along the way, meaning that implying that they started more violent and then eventually there's hope and there's moderation that's possible. So these are 4 different sort of ways in which, from a more political science approach, there are people looking at sort of these questions of Islamism as whether it's moderate or violent. And the reason why the question is important, because of course it often reflects some of our own assumptions as scholars when we actually approach and try to make sense and explain and understand the phenomenon of violence in Islam. The 4th area is what is the nature of this violence, according to 3 criteria in particular: the question of legitimacy, the question of domination, and normality. Here there are 2 categories of responses. Those who consider violence to be legitimate, dominating, and normal. Okay, so that's one group of people, including Burqa. And then those who consider violence as illegitimate, dominating, and pathological. You'll notice that many of my references are French, so that's one of my biases. So, but I hope that, given sort of the more German and possibly Anglo or possibly American, I don't know all of your backgrounds, but from the titles on the program, that this will be another perspective that could add to the richness of our conversation. A fifth question is: are we facing the question of radicalization of Islam or Islamization of what is already? And I'm coining here, I'm using a francisisme, because we say radicalité in French, but radicality in English I don't think exists, but it's actually useful to radicality, the radicalness maybe, but I like radicality as it is often used in other contexts. And so the Islamization of radicality as such. And so that's, I think, something which is important to talk about as well in our way of conceptualizing sort of, where do we, when we study the phenomenon of violence in Islam, how do we think about it and what are the a prioris that we're bringing to the study? And that is one of them implicitly. And so there are 4 categories of responses in this case, theoretically, on these opposing ways of thinking about it. Of course, Keppel defends the position of the first, that it's about the radicalization of Islam. It's the religion itself that gets to be radicalized. On the complete other side, of course, you have Olivier Roy, who talks about the Islamization of radicality and who puts the emphasis, therefore, on the Islamization of political violence in general, reflecting a kind of general nihilism presented in the form of an ideological cause to fight for. And that's important because in this case, the root cause of the problem is radicality in society and not necessarily in Islam per se. And others, of course, argue, as you would expect, sort of that both are necessary to understand the phenomenon of violence in Islam today. Sociological determinants are as important as root causes of radicalization. And what's interesting is that there's a fourth position which says that neither of these two propositions is correct. And I will need to go and use the backup copy here. Exactly. And it's a position by Bourka, who says that violence in the name of Islam comes from political radicalization, which always precedes religious radicalization. So for him, the religious radicalization is a secondary development, not the first root cause of it. And so that's one thing. Then another question is about Islam in its relations to violence. Is it a problem in and of itself, or is it a solution as such, interestingly enough? Okay, that may not be something that you've come across as often, but there are two approaches here which are often sort of coming out. Islam in its relation to violence is indeed a problem in and of itself, and I'll talk more about that at the end of my presentation. And finally, of course, there's those who think of Islam as a solution as such, despite the fact that, or even with aspects which can legitimize the use of violence in particular contexts, especially, of course, as you all know, in the case of legitimate self-defense. And that, of course, is interpreted in different ways in the tradition over time, and more recently because of terrorist attacks for political, ideological questions, especially in the Palestinian case. And, but I note here that this approach is as prior to the Arab Spring, because since the Arab Spring, Al-Az's position has changed quite a lot, officially and unofficially, on some of these questions. And so that's why here this one is a pre-Arab Spring position. Do political factors supersede religious ones is again another way of looking at these questions. Three main perspectives exist. Certain specialists claim that mobilization and violence in the name of Islam is explained primarily through political responses, politics over religion. And here we see the influence of Habermas in this case. And others claim the opposite, religion over politics. Eliade goes back a long time ago already, and Castel much more recently. And finally, there's a third perspective as well, which claims that in the case of violence in the name of Islam, the phenomenon is definitely at the intersection of both religion and politics. That's not unusual. 8, do political factors supersede religious ones? Sorry, that's, this is not the latest version of my prompt. I'm sorry. That was not the right version copy. So 8, should there be new priorities in how to study this phenomenon? And here there are two approaches. One is the approach that says that we need to avoid studying violence in Islam in terms of being a trope, whether already existing within Islam or an external factor influencing it, by focusing more on the impact of this violence in terms of terror, and why are so many human beings reacting with horror in the face of this violence. And this is Assad, as an anthropologist, who brings up sort of this particular kind of question. Another one is Amrab, who talks about the focus being on asking why and how are terrorist groups inspired by an Islamic and an Islamist ideology as such, given that there is an already predetermined sort of way in his argument that they are already radicalized before they necessarily sort of think of it in terms of Islam. I don't, by the way, necessarily agree with many of these positions, but I'm trying to lay them, their diversity out. Here it is, now. 9. Good. Is there an ideal or preferred epistemological solution, especially when it comes to how to relate to radical Islamists? Now we're moving from the analysis per se to how one relates on the ground to the political challenges that the rise of Islamist extremism has had in our societies internationally. And here two approaches which are confronted often and I feel that they're actually again in complementarity, is inclusion moderation versus exclusion radicalization. So some would argue that the first approach is that there is a need to integrate Islamist organizations as part of a more pluralist form of governance that leads them to moderation, and here you have the authors, and finally you have the others who argue, and it's not opposite in this case, so that's why it's important to make these distinctions, but not necessarily thinking of them as always in opposition, that excluding them of the formal political dynamics contribute to their increased radicalization, which in turn, and that's where it's different, it's not opposed, which in turn only delegitimizes them to a growing number of Muslims. And that, I think, is in part what's been happening. And if you look at the statistics on religiosity in Egypt more recently, it's quite stunning that some surveys come up with 40% of Egyptians who would supposedly not be interested in identifying to religion or Islam in any way. And that's quite an amazing statistics to come up with. I don't know, and I have no point of comparison regarding that. But we may be coming into a different age of how to relate to notions of religiosity and in majority Muslim societies as well. And of course, what you don't see down here, but I made a point of saying that many of the counter-violent extremist programs are relying on on one or two or somehow a combination of these two approaches when it comes to developing the reasons for their own programs. Those who use preventing violent extremism are softer in many ways, and they understand sort of a larger framework of tools to be used when it comes to relating to violence in Islam or people that have been radicalized in one shape or form or another. Finally, whoops, let me just do this one. At the end, and here I'm going to use more of a realpolitik approach that would ask, is violence in the name of Islam or violence committed in the name of Islam is a weapon of the weak or a weapon of the powerful? That, again, these are sometimes the big questions that some people are asking. And so Verges says that violence committed in the name of Islam would be an instrument or a weapon for the weak, versus Chomsky in general, not specifically to Islam in this case, who would actually be looking at the notion of terror and violence as a weapon of the strong. And Chomsky, of course, goes much further, saying that often, depending on one's anchoring in terms of political ideology, one could attribute violence and terror to some ideological discourses, but not necessarily to others that could be, from if one measures the degrees of violence, equally violent. But one not necessarily recognizing this as part of the overall equation. And that's part of the ways in which the language functions for the powerful. So at the end, I'd like to look at contemporary transformations of Muslim hermeneutics, of receptions and the concept of violence in Islam. And here what we see is a variety of different ways in which Muslim interpretations of Islam in the face of the rising development of Daesh in particular. Al-Qaeda did not quite have the same impact, but the Daesh has had a tremendous, it's kind of like it helped sort of at the tipping point in terms of so many Muslim organizations and Muslim individuals at all levels feeling committed to be much more public about their understanding of the relation of what Islam is, and within that whether or not there's place for Islam and for violence and so on and so forth. And so in the different approaches in reacting, you still have the polemical approaches, those who continue to believe that there is room for understanding that, if necessary, violence is a means to an end legitimized by a particular Islamic interpretation. And there's an old tradition, of course, of using that for a variety of reasons. And there's an increase, and I would argue, but that's a subjective approach on my part, that there's an increase in apologetic responses, that in the face of a lot of both Muslims and non-Muslims claiming that we need to hear more Muslims rejecting the kind of violence that has been associated to Daesh in recent years, that therefore there should be a clear positioning. And that has forced in turn many Muslims to become apologetic about how they understand the relationship of their understanding of Islam with notions of certain kinds of violence. Rejecting sort of the terror violence in some cases, but yet legitimizing some other forms of violence, especially for self-defense, as we know. Then the third approach, I would call it rejectionist, is those, and there's an old tradition in Islam of that, particularly among Sufis, that have consistently have a discourse that there is no place for violence in their understanding of Islam. But that rejectionist movement, I would say, or variety of perspectives, is gaining ground and growing not just in Sufi circles. Now you find the rejectionist positions also in a variety of different other environments. And not just, again, the modernist, historically critical Muslim approach to understanding Islam, but also in some traditional context too. Finally, there is what I call the transformational approach in terms of hermeneutics, which are those Muslims who are really reflecting in a way deeper to making sense of how the tradition could actually led to some people interpreting it in such extreme ways, and therefore sort of having to do sort of one's homework, quote unquote, in order to be able to rethink about the place of violence in Islam, if any place at all. And there you have, and that's why I call it transformational, because there's a sense of actually addressing sort of theological, hermeneutical issues in looking at to what extent there is room at all for violence in Islam. And this final slide that I have in my presentation is actually rooted in a variety of examples that I've collected together with the help of Wael as well, especially at the end of 2016, early 2017, where we collected over 120 statements by leading Muslim intellectuals and scholars and religious figures internationally. Those are, a lot of them are in Arabic, of course, but many of them are in other languages, including Western languages. And then there are 61 statements by Muslim organizations, mostly transnational and in some cases national Muslim organizations as well, speaking out against the kind of atrocities which have been associated to the rise of Daesh. And so if you want, I mean, I have in a different, whoops, here we go. And so here's my list of all of these different statements, and it's 40. It's literally, I mean, it's literally 40, and here are the sources and whatnot. But there's like 42 pages of these statements that are all about rejecting the violence. And what's fascinating to me is the way in which they all are about the rejection of Daesh, of which only part of them are going to be making the intellectual effort to therefore deduce, well, therefore what do we do this problem? Because some of them are doing it in an apologetic way, as I mentioned, and others are doing it from a more transformational way. And so you really have like a huge variety here, Sunni, Shiite, you name it. It's fascinating to see all of this particular kind of outward expression of resistance to what some have called the manipulation or the instrumentalization of Islam in the name of terror in a way that for most Muslims, as we all know, is unacceptable. So I'll stop here. These are some elements that I wanted to share with you, and hopefully we can discuss and entertain some conversation about this.